Okay. So again, this is the Wetland Study Club. We're meeting on December 17th, 2025, and we had a survey that went out to the folks who are part of the Wetland Study Club asking what kind of topics would be of interest. And they indicated that one of the topics was conservation easements. So I reached out to the Whatcom Land Trust, and they were really receptive to the idea of coming and talking with us a little bit about their perspective on conservation easements. And Tyler was gracious enough to come and chat with us today. So Tyler has been the conservation easement coordinator at Whatcom Land Trust since last year, and he loves working with landowners who are passionate about stewarding their land. He's originally from Connecticut, and Tyler lived in Colorado for 4 years before coming to the Whatcom Land Trust, and he attended Colorado College, where he graduated with a BA in environmental studies. While in Colorado, Tyler completed an internship at the Palmer Land Conservancy, and that's where he gained experience working with conservation easements. He also worked on a regenerative flower farm, which allowed him to see conservation from the user side or the producer side, so that provides an interesting perspective. So we asked him here today to talk about kind of the land trust perspective. They manage a lot of conservation easements. They help people write conservation easements. So we asked them, and Tyler in particular, to just give his perspective that maybe give some insight in ways that we can use conservation easements, maybe how we can be better in using this tool, and some maybe there's some nuances to it that we're not aware of. So I am going to stop right there. And Tyler, if you want to take it away, feel free to introduce any more about yourself, and then feel free to share your slides. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome.
And we'll have Q&A after it, right? Is that right? Q&A after.
Yeah, we will. Yeah. And then folks, if questions come up and, want to ask like clarifying questions or anything like that, definitely feel free to ask, raise your hand, or kind of unmute yourself during the presentation. Can people see my slides?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. So yeah, thanks for that introduction. Super grateful to be speaking here with you all today, and super excited to hear that people are interested in this topic. It's something that I could definitely talk, on and on and on about, because it's, my job and my world right now. But yeah, so we'll definitely dive into the different nuances of what we call easement stewardship. But first, I kind of want to just talk a little bit about the land trust as a whole. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with the land trust, so I just want to give a little bit of context about kind of the work that we do and where easements kind of fit in that work before we get into the different nuances. And then I'll, talk about the different, the basics of conservation easements, starting with a definition and then kind of building off of that and talking about how we steward easements. And then I'll kind of finish with that decision-making process of, the different ways that we kind of assess whether a conservation easement is a right fit or not a right fit for properties that we're looking to conserve. And then we'll finish with the Q&A. So just to start, what is a land trust? A land trust is a nonprofit conservation organization that works to conserve and care for kind of the lands in their local community. And there's about 1,200 land trusts across the United States, and 24 of them are in Washington State. And really each, land trust is, they share kind of common priorities of, protecting land for wildlife habitat, for farmland protection, for forest protection, equitable access to nature and securing recreational interest, as well as kind of increasing climate resilience across different local ecosystems. But really what makes each land trust different is the community that they serve. And that kind of fits into Whatcom Land Trust, because for us, we're situated within Whatcom County. Our office is in downtown Bellingham, but we work all across the county, and we work to conserve, protect, and care for Whatcom County's wild and working lands forever. And we're a nationally accredited land trust, so we follow nationally regulated standards and practices, and we're audited every 5 years by this organization called the Land Trust Alliance. who, have their own nationally regulated standards and practices. So they kind of keep us in check and make sure that, we're doing what we're saying that we're doing. But we kind of fulfill our mission and vision through a variety of different ways. On the front end, acquiring land, we have several different conservation tools. One conservation tool is fee title land, so that's land that we own and manage. Another way that we conserve land is through conservation easements, which, just briefly speaking, it's a legal agreement with the landowner to kind of protect that piece of land forever. And then we've also conserved land through facilitation and exchanges. So, land that we don't own, but we've assisted in the protection of it in some way, and we don't have a forever stewardship obligation for that property. And really, we, that's kind of the work that we do on the front end. And really, because land trusts are so centered around the community, we really try to emphasize that community engagement and community involvement, because stewardship and doing the stewardship work and caring for the lands here in the county isn't just about kind of the work that we do internally, but it's also promoting that ethic of stewardship throughout our community. So we really try to get the different communities here in the county involved through our volunteer program. And, we host work parties as well as a volunteer ambassador program. And, we table at different events as well. So we really try to, engage with the community in a variety of different ways. And here's a map of kind of our service area. We've in green, you'll see properties that this map is a little outdated. It's from 2022, so we've kind of filled in the map a little bit more. But in green, you'll see properties that we own and we manage ourselves. Yellow is conservation easement lands that we hold, and red is facilitation projects that we've helped to facilitate those transfers of. And last year, we recently published our conservation plan, and that was kind of a big step for us because we really worked to receive community input and try to, listen to what folks were most concerned about and what priority areas they were concerned about, so we could kind of align our goals with the community goals. And really, you'll see kind of that in our project selection, where properties that we own are situated along the forks of the Nooksack, and they're really centered around, habitat and ecological protection. Conservation easements, they're kind of all over the place, but you'll notice that we have quite a few within that area north of Bellingham, within the kind of the Fraser Valley outflow, because of those prime agricultural soils that are really important to protect from conversion to development of residential development. So it's kind of just a little bit about our service area. And I just want to briefly talk about, our ownership and kind of what that means. We currently own around 6,500 acres of land, but by early 2026, we'll own and manage 8,312 acres of land here in the county. And one thing that we emphasize as landowners is adaptive management. So we're really thinking about that long-term vision to achieve kind of ecological, I guess, maximization. We're thinking about doing planting work when we first acquire a property, and then, thinning work 50 years down the road. And then we're also thinking about doing in-stream restoration as well. And, because we have that, adaptive management, long-term vision kind of approach to management, we really value the different partnerships that we have with a variety of folks and entities. A good example of that is Edford Creek property, which is along the South Fork. We partnered with Lummi Nation for over 10 years now, doing in-stream restoration work. They're currently on their third phase of engineered log jam projects, and it takes a couple of years, as I'm sure most of you know, to be able to complete those projects from start to finish. So it's been really cool to work with them and kind of have to see that reach of the South Fork really be restored to a point where kind of we're starting to see ecological benefits from that. And another piece kind of that we emphasize in our management is kind of community buffers as well. So areas, for example, Maple Creek Reach is a good example of areas that we own and restore along the floodplain, because we want those rivers to be dynamic and allow for their natural river function to take course. So kind of our ownership of those pieces allow for those areas to serve both as prime habitat, but also community buffers for communities like Maple Falls that are closer to the forks and the Nooksack, allow those areas to kind of flood without damage to human life or property. And that's something that we've seen over the past week is really important to kind of have those buffers to protect those more critical areas. And then diversity habitat is the last piece of ownership. We it's kind of a common misnomer that the land trust just wants to plant trees everywhere and they want to see all of the county reforested. We don't want to do that. We believe that forests should be where they should be, but we also see the value in creating edge habitat and field habitat as well. So Ladies of the Lake is a field habitat property that we've worked to conserve, and we currently manage as field habitat in South Lake Whatcom area. And facilitation projects, just briefly about that. So again, like these are properties that we've worked to help raise the funds for the transfers of ownership into different public entities. And we don't have that forever stewardship obligation, but properties like Lake Whatcom Park, Lookout Mountain Forest Preserve, and Chuckanut Mountain Park are some of our key facilitation projects. And really, we decided those to be facilitation projects just because we just didn't identify a really strong need for us to be involved forever. And we credit ourselves with about 10,000 acres of land as facilitation projects. All right, so conservation easements, the reason why that y'all came here today. We'll start with the basics. Oops, sorry about that. Did not mean to do that. Let's keep going here. If you had to fit the definition into one sentence, you could describe it as a conservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement with landowners that protect the conservation values unique to each specific property in perpetuity, which means forever. So how does that work, and kind of like what's the nuts and bolts of that, and what does that look like in practice? Well, as I'm sure most of you know, when you own a piece of property, you have your bundle of rights, as we call it. Your development rights, your mineral rights, your water rights, and a conservation easement removes some of those rights, mainly the development rights, and the landowner then gets compensated for the removal of those rights. And the key piece of this is that then the conservation easement restricts certain things from happening. So if you remove your development rights, the conservation easement greatly restricts your ability to develop that property. And the land trust in these exchanges, the land trust is not the land manager or the owner of the property. The landowners still own and manage the property, and the landowners can also sell or transfer ownership of that property. But the easement stays in place forever, and the easement, runs with the land through every succeeding landowner. And these pictures here kind of just show what a conservation easement document looks like. A key piece here that I wanted to highlight is kind of this purpose statement you'll see at the top of the second page. That is kind of the foundational cornerstone of the conservation easement. Really, it's trying to get at that why. Why was the conservation easement first put in place, and what is the conservation easement trying to protect? And then from that purpose statement, the different restrictions, you'll see section 6 as permitted uses, and then section 7 is prohibited uses. Those really build off of that foundational purpose statement, and they really set the tone for the rest of the easement. So at the land trust, we hold over 114 conservation easements that span more than 10,000 acres of land. And believe it or not, every conservation easement that we hold is unique to that specific property. So I was trying to figure out like how to describe the different types of easements that we hold, because they're all pretty different, but mainly I broke them down into 3 different categories. The first category that I broke them down into is ecological easements. And these are the most common easement that we hold. And you'll see within that purpose statement, they'll highlight conservation values such as protecting forests, protecting wetlands, protecting shoreline, protecting wildlife, salmon habitat, really stuff like that. that is kind of centered around habitat protection and maximizing ecological benefit out of private land. And a good example of that, which we've kind of talked a lot about within from like our comm side of things, Agate Pond Preserve is about 100 acres of forest and a really prime forest and wetland habitat located in the Lake Whatcom watershed that we recently established a conservation easement on over this past year. And the landowner has actively stewarded that property for 40 plus years. And it's just been super awesome to see how that piece of land has been taken care of for such a long period of time. And now the conservation easement kind of solidifies that that piece of land will kind of stay that way forever. And all that stewardship work won't go to waste. So those are ecological easements. The second type of easement that we hold are recreational easements. And, you know, recreational easements, that kind of like, it tells half the story because um, these easements, we hold around 20 easements with county parks, and they, you know, they protect the recreational values of the property, ensure that the recreational use of the property by the public is kind of protected forever. But these easements also protect the habitat values of the property as well. So, for example, with Point Whitehorn, we first purchased that property, and then we built a trail on that property, and then we transferred ownership to county parks with a conservation easement on that property. So county parks could manage that human use of it going forward. And we wanted to put the easement on it just to ensure that the ecological habitat and the wetlands over there were still be able to be protected despite, you know, a park being on the property. So those are recreational easements. And the last type of easement that we hold are working lands easements. So as you might guess, you know, they protect, you know, both agricultural and working forest land. So some of those conservation values that you'll see in the purpose statement are, you know, agricultural, working forest values. Soil health is something that we like to include in there, you know, protecting the soil to ensure that it stays in a state of productivity forever, that it can produce food and fiber. And with these easements, they're a little different than our ecological easements just because um, with working lands, you know, there's often an active operation that comes along with that. And we recognize that, you know, there's not a one size, I guess, fits all practices. You know, there's a bunch of different agricultural practices and forestry techniques and practices that, you know, you can't capture in one specific bucket. So we really want, you know, producers and foresters to be able to kind of be flexible and adapt their management practices over time, especially, you know, as BMPs change over time. And, you know, we have no idea kind of what, you know, the land will look like 100 years from now, 200 years from now with climate change as well. So in those easements, we require the landowner work with the conservation district or NRCS to establish what we call a farm plan to really ensure that, you know, the agricultural use of the property is protected and that there is agricultural use of the property, but it's not just limited to one specific bucket of protection. And one of my favorite conservation easements that we working lands conservation easements that we hold is on alluvial farms. So a really cool thing about the project is we were able to protect the farmland piece of it, but we're also able to work with Matt to protect the riparian buffer along salmon bearing Dale Creek there that flows into the Sumas. So really, like with that project and with a lot of our working lands easements, we try and emphasize that coexistence of ecological protection and also farmland protection as well. All right, so now you've entered into a conservation easement with the land trust and we're the holder of that easement. So what does the land trust actually do and kind of what does that look like in practice? Well, we kind of call what we do easement stewardship. So, and really what that means is ensuring that the landowner is adhering to the terms of the conservation easement and, you know, upholding their end of the bargain, so to speak. And we ensure that the landowner is adhering to those terms through annual monitoring. So at a minimum, we go out to every conservation easement property at least once a year and then document any changes that have been made to the land. And we're really trying to ensure that the current uses of the land are consistent with those terms of the conservation easement. And we have over 90 different landowners, and a lot of them are very good stewards that really care about their land. But unfortunately, violations of the conservation easement do come up every once in a while. They're very, very infrequent. But, one of our responsibilities as a holder of that easement is to really enforce those terms as needed. So when violations do occur, we do work with the landowner to kind of work through those and come to a resolution. But one thing that we found that is probably the most important piece of easement stewardship and ensuring that easements are durable is the communication and the relationship piece. We see conservation easements as forever partnerships with the landowner to ensure that the conservation values of the property remain protected and intact. And the best way to ensure that those values are protected is to kind of steward those relationships with the landowner, since they're the ones living on the property and using the property and managing the property. So if you have a good relationship with your landowners, it becomes a mutually beneficial partnership where both you and the landowner are working towards those same goals of habitat or agricultural protection. And really, it's also about trust too, because the more trust that you build over time with your landowners, the more beneficial those conservation outcomes become, and the more durable those easements become over time as well, because they do last forever. So you really want to try to make sure that you have this really strong foundation at the beginning. So going forward, stewardship becomes a really strong and mutually beneficial partnership. And this relationship too, it begins on the front end as well. During easement negotiations, open communication is extremely important because you know there's a lot of different opinions on conservation easements. And there's a lot of folks that believe that when you enter into a conservation easement, you just give up your property rights and then that's it. Well, we at the land trust here, we really try to make sure that when folks choose to enter into a conservation easement, it's a mutually created easement. That's not just kind of a one-sided relationship where one side feels like they got slighted by the others. We really open up that dialogue at the beginning to make sure that both parties kind of have their needs met, and that we can kind of work through any concerns that they have at the beginning to make sure that the landowner kind of feels comfortable giving up their or exchanging their rights, and making sure that they don't feel that they were kind of wronged in that process. So that's probably the biggest piece of even easement stewardship that I wanted to highlight, but just kind of diving more into the nuances of the conservation easement document itself. There's a really fine balance between flexibility and specificity with easement language. As I mentioned, easements are forever, so you really want them to be able to stand the test of time. You want your restrictions that you establish now in the present to be able to hold up, 50 or 100 years or 200 years down the road. But as we all know, it's pretty impossible to predict the future. So one way that easements try to stay durable in this way through its language is to allow for flexibility. And flexibility can look like, it can look in a variety of different ways with conservation easements, but the most common way that you'll see is using language that is more kind of vague and open-ended and kind of leaves it open to interpretation, which is like a good thing on the one hand, because you know it can give landowners more wiggle room, especially with succeeding landowners who don't really have a connection to the original grantors, to the original folks who put the easement on the property. It can give those landowners more wiggle room to kind of use the property and then adjust to the conservation easement and its restrictions. However, the downside of that is that it can leave a lot of gray area and ambiguity and make it difficult for easements to be enforced and fulfill their original intent if the or certain restriction is more vague, and if the intent isn't clearly stated. So that's kind of one piece where being too flexible can really hinder your conservation easement going forward. But then on the other side of the spectrum, being too specific or, too absolute, that can also create larger issues down the road, especially as, conditions of the property change over time. So, for example, if were to create a conservation easement that was centered around the protection of one specific species, and you centered all your restrictions and all the language around that specific species, but the species had a chance of going extinct or migrating to a different habitat or something like that. If you created an easement like that, and then the easement or then the species were to be extinct or move away from that property, then the easement basically becomes null, and then you don't have anything to protect. So one way that folks try to I guess, combat this, being too absolute, is broadening it a little more to, if we're going to keep using this example, instead of protecting that specific species, you could say something like protecting the forest habitat or the wetland habitat on the property. That, that becomes more enforceable, and it's not just kind of that single narrow version. It's kind of getting at the whole picture and the whole ecological system, is instead of that, one single species. So really, there's just a fine balance being being too flexible with the restrictions of a conservation easement and being too absolute. And when we look to acquire a property or put a conservation easement on the property, we really try to envision, not just what that property looks like now, but what are the potential threats and risks that could occur, 100 years down the road, just so we can make sure that we're trying to build in as much flexibility as we can to ensure that the easement can adjust to those different changes over time. And another piece, with that kind of like time scales piece, as easements age, kind of difficulty of enforcement does increase, just because, as I mentioned before, land changes hands all the time, and landowners pass, landowners, want to sell property, and sometimes would just want to move on from their land and start a new chapter of their life. So as kind of the easement changes hands over time, often what you'll see is that new ideas come up, and new landowners, sometimes don't have that same preservationist or conservation mindset that the original grantors had. And another, facet of this is that, conservation easements, at the end of the day, they're a legal document that is legally enforced, and it has a lot of legalese in it. And there's not a lot of folks that don't have experience reading legal documents. We found it's hard for them to understand and really truly understand those terms of the conservation easement. So that's just another key piece for us, establishing that relationship. Whenever an easement changes hands, we really try to meet the landowners out there as soon as we can and start that relationship, from day one, and explain kind of what they can and can't do, answer any questions that they have, and try to figure out ways that we can support them in kind of adjusting to the conservation easement and adjusting to their property as well. So, and overall, these lessons become a little more relevant. These lessons that we learn become more relevant, considering that easements last forever and they are extremely hard to amend. Amendments can occur, but they're pretty rare. And as I mentioned before, the land trust is a nationally accredited land trust through the Land Trust Alliance, and LTA has their own standards and practices that are nationally accepted, and they've been in place longer than our organization has existed. And their S&Ps establish pretty strict criteria of that an amendment must meet in order to be approved. And there's a lot of different criteria, but the basics of it is that a conservation easement or an amendment has to have a net neutral or net beneficial impact on the conservation values. And this conservation or this criteria was established to protect against obvious net negative outcomes that don't benefit the land. So, for example, if a new landowner moved to the property and they didn't establish the original easement, but they moved to the property and then they wanted to build another house that wasn't allowed by the easement, they wanted to amend the conservation easement to build another house, that's something that definitely could not be approved, because that would be a net negative outcome. But the key thing for amendments is that we can never reduce the restrictions of an easement. We can only make them more restrictive, or I guess the same amount of restrictive, if we're trying to clarify language that was, unclear in the original easement when it was established. And so just lastly, just to talk about kind of our decision-making process and kind of what that looks like in terms of whether or not to use a conservation easement. The big thing here is, as I'm sure we all know, preservation does not equal restoration. As you might have guessed, conservation easements are really good because they restrict certain uses and things from happening on a property. They're really good at preserving the current conditions of a property. However, for us, properties that we flag as restoration sites that, require a lot of active management in order to kind of restore degraded habitat, um, those we don't really consider to be, the right fit for conservation easements at first. So, for example, these are pictures from a property that we purchased a couple years ago, right along California Creek, up along Drayton Harbor Road, and we purchased it, and knowing that it was going to be an active restoration site, it contained, multiple trailers and derelict vehicles, an uninhabitable house, and just a lot of junk on the property that was really impacting the ability of the property to serve as salmon habitat as we wanted it to be. Um, so to restore the property, we demoed the house, removed the vehicles and the trailers, and conducted multiple plantings out there, as well as a cultural resource assessment. And with the intent of trying to restore the ecological function of the property. And for this property, again, like, it did not make any sense to put an easement on it at the start, just because for all the work that we wanted to do on the property, we had an idea of the different steps that we were going to take to restore the property, but it wasn't something where, we felt like we knew every single thing that was going to happen, because oftentimes, as I'm sure you all know, in restoration and habitat management, things come up that you just can't intend. So this was a property where, it didn't make sense at the time to put a conservation easement on it, but now that we're doing the restoration work, and maybe when those trees that we planted, get a little more established, 20, 30 years down the road, maybe it makes sense for us to put a conservation easement on it. And it ultimately comes down to risk assessment, I guess. And for a conservation easement to make sense for us, there has to be a certain amount of risk involved to warrant it. So, for example, if there's, some sort of prime ecological area that's at risk of being developed or converted to a different land use, where the conservation values were at high risk of being lost, then that would make sense, because, we consider that permanency piece, because easements are forever. And if the risk is high enough for us to, warrant having a forever stewardship obligation to that property, then for us, it really makes sense to put a conservation easement on it. But, if there's a property like for this California Creek property, we didn't see an imminent risk of, any kind of habitat being degraded, because it was already degraded to the point where we needed to do a lot of restoration work. So I guess the key takeaway from this is that easements are really good at restricting uses, but, they don't really, the adaptive management and active management don't necessarily go hand in hand with conservation easements. And it's really not always as black and white as easement or no easement. Generally, it's more of a timing thing, and, maybe doing restoration work first and then putting a conservation easement on the property after the restoration work is finished. So that's all I had today. Folks are welcome to ask any questions that they want. And I can also, if people want to follow with me, I can also send over my email or anything like that. But yeah, thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Tyler. That was really fascinating, and it's always great to hear, another perspective. And I think it's really important to hear the perspective of an organization that holds the easements and has to enforce that long-term obligation. So thank you. I think there's quite a few people on the call, so I think if folks want to raise their hand, that might be a good way. And Tyler and I can kind of together work at making sure everybody gets to answer their question or their questions answered. Do you want to just start, Tyler, and I'll keep an eye on whether we're
Yeah, for
missing
sure.
folks?
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
Yeah, I don't see anything right now.
looks like Dash has his
Oh,
hand
yeah. Oh,
up.
you have to move between the pages. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. We'll do Dash first.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that presentation. That was great. I learned a lot from that. You
Awesome.
talked about at the end about how a conservation easement with its restrictions can kind of have some tension with adaptive management. Have you seen some ways where you can kind of reconcile those two tools?
Yeah. I mean, yes, on the one hand, so I guess the first thing that comes to mind is kind of properties that we have conserved through conservation easement that we recognize that, there's forest management that can happen down the road. And, forest management, is something that, has evolved over time and, it's adapted to changing conditions. And one way that, with our newer easements now, we try to build in provisions that allow for forest management. And the way that it's phrased is, the grantor can conduct forest management on the property according to a forest management plan that's approved by us. And that way it kind of allows for flexibility in different management options. So because forest management isn't just, one specific thing, it can be a variety of different things. And that's something that we've tried to build into our newer easements within the past 10 years. But unfortunately, with our older easements, those easements didn't build in those provisions. So again, it's kind of, they can go hand in hand, but you really have to think ahead before you put the easement in place, because once you put the easement in place, it becomes pretty difficult to change the things after the fact. If that answers your question.
That does. Thank you.
Yeah. I saw one in the chat. Um, do you ever partner with tribes to preserve properties? If so, what does that partnership look like, or how does it function? So yeah, we have 7 conservation easements that we hold with Lummi Nation, and those are properties that were former agricultural land that were drained, and now Lummi is doing a lot of restoration work to kind of restore tidal and estuarine function to those properties. And those easements we acquired, knowing that there's going to be a lot of restoration work to be done. So the restrictions of that easement are pretty flexible in the sense that I'd have to look at the specific language, but I'm pretty sure it's, they're allowed to kind of do any sort of habitat restoration work that they want to. But that easement really restricts any other use besides habitat restoration or tribal use. So they can't, build, housing, or they can't build any other structures on the property except for habitat management piece. If that answers your question, Evan. Alec, I see that you can't raise your hand, but you have another question.
Yeah, thanks for presenting, Tyler. I don't know if this is happening to any WLT properties right now, but I'm curious what happens with a conservation easement when the land under that easement is lost. So like with the flooding in Skagit and Whatcom County, there are a lot of riverfront properties that have lost a significant chunk of land. And like you said, rivers, part of conservation easements is to allow them and their floodplains to do their natural processes. But how do amendments or contractual changes happen when you actually lose the land under an easement?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we have one property that comes to mind is a conservation easement that we have right along the North Fork in Glacier, and every year that property is losing shoreline habitat just because that river just wants to move right along that shoreline of the conservation easement. And that's something that the landowner recognized was a possibility of occurring over time. And for them, it was just important to kind of protect the habitat piece and the ecological functioning of that piece. So for them, they were okay with the loss of the property. But I guess that's just something that, you know, that's just something that happens, and it's something that you have to work with the landowner. Like if the landowner is concerned about, losing land, um, I guess, are you thinking about like ways that the easement can prevent like land loss or something like that?
More along the lines of what happens contractually, because there's a compensation component
Mm.
associated with conservation easements. And, if they say, hey, I have this land and I'm not developing it, and that's part of the easement, but then they lose the land, like, do they keep getting their compensation, or does something have to change in the contract to reflect the new conditions?
Yeah, okay. I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, so the compensation is a one-time thing. So it's not like crap where they're getting paid over time. They get paid out once that easement gets established, at the time of easement establishment. So, there wouldn't be any kind of changes within that property. And we haven't come across a conservation easement that has lost, the entirety of the property where it becomes, literally unenforceable. Like you can't even go out there. But I guess the easement, if that were to happen, I mean, the easement would just kind of change its protection mechanism from, if it was like forest habitat, it would still just protect that like floodplain habitat, which it would now become. And then over time, the river would potentially move, and, yeah. So I guess that answers I hope that answers your question. We haven't come across that specific scenario. So yeah.
Thanks, Tyler. And I think we've got two questions in the chat. Maybe the first one, trying to go in order. Thomas says, have you ever held a conservation easement for compensatory mitigation projects? And is that something the land trust does?
We currently do not hold any easements for compensatory mitigation, but we're working with the city on holding a easement that they're using for wetland mitigation. So it's something that we're open to exploring, but this is kind of like the first one that we've done of that kind. And that
Tyler, that one
easement,
is for the wetland mitigation bank, right? So like a large piece of property.
right, exactly, yeah. And I believe that easement too, like I've seen a couple of drafts of it. It's really based on that kind of like Army Corps of Engineers template. So yeah, that's something that we're exploring, but we have not done a lot of yet. And then
right.
Patricia, Patricia asked another question. Is the conservation easement affected if the parcel number changes? No, I'm gonna say no. We've recently done a boundary line adjustment on a property to clarify the boundary lines of the property, and the tax parcel number changed because of that boundary line adjustment, but the easement still stays in place. And within every easement, there's kind of one of the exhibits is a legal description that describes the boundaries of the property. So even if a parcel number changes, you can go back to that description and have a surveyor look at it. And we also get our property surveyed as well. So we kind of know where those boundary lines are. So the conservation easement stays with those boundary lines.
It looks like Evan has his hand up.
Yeah, Evan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, building off of Tom's question here, so we have multiple compensatory mitigation sites, and we, so I work for Washington State Department of Transportation, and we're looking for potential long-term steward partners that we can transfer to. So, and would the land trust be interested in those sort of smaller sites that are more like 2 to 15 acre kind of levels?
I think that's a good question. I think it depends. The acreage, and we do look at acreage. We hold our smallest conservation easement is like a half an acre, and then our largest conservation easement is almost 22,000 or 2,200 acres. So acreage in that sense doesn't matter. For us, it really depends on location and proximity. One thing that we look at with acquisitions is, can we build those corridors? Can we build that continuity and contiguity with our properties that we protect to kind of bolster those habitat values? So if it's, I can, what I can do, Evan, is I can put my email in the chat, And I'm responsible for the easement stewardship stuff, but I can, if you want to shoot me an email with kind of what you guys are looking for, I can pass you along to our conservation team and there are acquisitions team, and they can kind of look at those pieces that you guys are interested in putting an easement on.
I will do that. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Tyler. And I'll give you a second while you put something in the chat for folks with your email. Or I can do it if you want. I can add it.
No, I just sent it in there. Yeah.
Okay, great. So it looks like Nick has a question. Hey, Tyler, how is the payment amount determined when entering into a conservation easement? Is it purely negotiations between the two parties, or is there an assessor involved? What's the ballpark amount, and who pays out?
Yeah. So who pays out? It depends. For most of our acquisitions, or for our working land easements, we partner with the county, and the county kind of secures that funding. But for easements that we hold ourselves, we pay it through different grants that we've secured. But how that amount is determined is through an appraisal. So before every easement gets put on a property, we have it appraised, and basically the value of the easement is determined by taking the market value of the property before the easement is established and subtracting the market value of the property after the easement is established. And that difference is kind of what the value of the easement is worth. And that's kind of what we pay out.
And then Tyler, to follow up on that, obviously it's a lot of work for the land trust to actually enforce an easement. So do you have sort of a management fee then you add on also?
Yeah, so with our with all of our easements, we request a stewardship contribution. And as of now, it is optional. But yeah, I mean, funding really depends for us. So like it's kind of a case by case basis.
And it's a one-time payment usually, that
it's a
stewardship
one-time
fee.
payment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then Amy has a question in the chat. The conservation easement is bound to survey and legal description of the site. Topographic changes in the land do not typically impact the easement. The easement can be rescinded and re-recorded if there's a desire for a change. Okay, so that's a clarifying statement. Does that make sense to you too, Tyler?
It's bound to survey Oh, sorry, I just lost it here.
Sorry. I've worked on these projects. I've worked on projects like this quite a bit, where land has been lost, and the conservation easements run with the land, and when the land changes form from like terrestrial to aquatic or otherwise, it's bound on the legal description and survey, not what is topographically present.
Mhm.
So
Right.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Amy.
that's what I would guess. Yeah. And so when we establish a property, we establish different photo points around the property that we take pictures at every year to kind of document those changes on the land. And for properties, along the riverfront, or for that piece of property that I was describing earlier, we've actually moved the photo points further south, just because we can't, get into the middle of the North Fork.
yeah,
So
and you can rescind a conservation easement and re-record it as site conditions change or if they're necessary. We did a lot of this for the 2021 floods, where, a lot of land was lost, but a lot of land is gained somewhere too. So the land doesn't really care where the easement is.
yeah, that is very true. That is very true.
And Amy Dearborn used to work with the Whatcom County Planning Department. Now she works for the City of Bellingham Planning Department. So thanks, Amy, for chiming in.
Awesome.
It is 12:53, and if we have a moment or two, if people have some last questions, otherwise we can move on to the wrap up. Just doing. Anybody else have a last question? Okay, well, Tyler, I really appreciate you being here. This has been excellent. Really good information for all of us. And if you don't mind, I can post the video and your slides on our webpage. And I will, I'm going to share my screen so that people can see. This is the Wetland Study Club webpage. It's something that it's all informal. So it's something that I just created just to host. People kept asking, do we have recordings? Do we have slides from previous events? And so this is just a place to host them. It has just a very simple landing page. And then if you go up in here in the right-hand corner, it's kind of hard, it's a little tiny text. I wish I could, maybe someday I'll learn how to change it. But up here it says events. If you click on events, then it has all the past events. So that's where like the slides and the videos reside. So as you'll see right now, we have as the upcoming event is what we just had today. I'm going to change that now to, past event, and I'll put the slides and video at this location. So thanks again, Tyler, and you generously offered your email address, so I really appreciate that. And it sounds like folks can contact you, and they've got a lot of experience in Whatcom Land Trust, and they don't just do conservation easements, so there might be some other topics too that would be of interest. I wanted to just share, as far as the next event, we will be having a couple of, quarterly events is kind of what we're shooting for, and we take kind of the summer off. So it's basically 3 events a year is what I'm hoping for. That's what we've been able to do for many years. And I did a survey, sent out a survey, a little Google survey, and this is the results about what kind of topics people wanted to hear about. So the first question, I don't know if you can see it very clearly. See if I can make it larger. No, I don't know how to make it larger. Anyway, I'll just read the question. It says, if we had a field trip, which of the options below are of interest to you? So the highest was the winter plant ID. Second highest was a field trip to a local mitigation or restoration site. So that's the first thing we're going to do in early part of 2026 is a winter plant ID. And there's a couple of folks who volunteered to help me put that together. So we'll hopefully do a field trip somewhere in the February range for that. And again, like I said, try to couple it maybe with a SWS sponsored happy hour. That'd be great. So we can see each other in person. The second question was, if we had a meeting instead of a field trip, which of the options below are of interest to you? And the Land Trust was the highest, the Land Trust talking about conservation easements. That's why we have a meeting today. But the other ones that we might want to do in the future is potential edits to the Bellingham and Whatcom County Critical Areas Ordinance. It could be other jurisdictions too. I know there's folks from other parts of the Puget Sound, so that might be of interest. Just generally a critical areas update preview. And then another one that was pretty high ranked was inviting a wetland professional to discuss monitoring methods. So monitoring of wetland mitigation sites. And we've done that before. It seems to be pretty popular, and we can do it again. If folks have someone as a speaker that they would, it could be a field trip or a speaker, that would be great to know of folks that you would recommend. So thank everybody again for being here. And Tyler, special thanks to you. Hopefully we can do a better job coming to you with the right project for the right tool. And I appreciate all your efforts to make sure these easements do what they're supposed to be doing, which is conserving the land and preserving those functions. Thank you. And as we close, I just want to give an acknowledgement to everyone that is trying to do their best to support people as they are impacted by the floods. I know that, I've been working in a work area where people are frantically walking around for the last couple of weeks. I know maybe people couldn't even attend today because that's the work they do, is they either have a property that's at risk or they're helping others that have a property at risk. So that's the importance of this work. Thanks everybody for doing that, and hope everybody stays safe and happy holidays.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.